I am not going to die. And there are some people right now that are not going to see death.
Thousands of people around the world are expecting to live forever.
So you're immortal, and physically immortal.
Absolutely.
They call themselves the Immortalists, and many speak of it not as a dream, but something they've already achieved.
We are part of the last mortal generation.
They congregate at festivals, concerts, and churches.
Welcome to the Church of Perpetual Life,
where they attempt to converge on a master plan to reverse aging, cure all disease, and extend life indefinitely.
To enable human beings to bypass nature, to accelerate technology that will result in humans merging into an environment of perpetual life.
They cheer on the various medical fields that could aid them, and when asked, most claim the frontier is far closer than one might imagine. And if they find themselves at the end of their lives despite their best efforts, they have a backup plan. They intend to freeze, tuck themselves safely into storage, and wait.
That person would go through a form of time travel, and perhaps 100 years from now, perhaps 200 years from now, perhaps 300 years from now, medicine would advance to the point where the person could be thawed, the damage repaired, and the person brought back to life.
They know they won't all make it. It's even likely that none of them will make it. But the Immortalists are nothing if not optimistic, and they gladly navigate through the objections of the scientific majority that have plagued them since the beginning, or the various gurus draining their bank accounts in exchange for illusory promises, and the spectacular failures from the very caretakers themselves, tasked with ushering their frozen bodies safely into the future, proving that destruction lurks in even their contingency plans.
One day, we're going to thaw out one of these individuals, and we'll find that the person is nothing but a dead blob of protoplasm.
Because no one said living forever would be easy.
People like myself. But I never looked back. Once I experienced being physically immortal, I never looked back.
I now think there are 5 categories of people: hardcore deathists, softcore deathists, closet immortalists, softcore immortalists, and hardcore immortalists. I consider myself a hardcore immortalist.
Despite being an ancient idea, the Immortalist movement rarely moves beyond its place at the far fringes. It features an assemblage of futurist and technophiles, so-called health gurus, celebrity spokesmen, some evangelists, and a blend of sincere believers and those looking to exploit them. Many are older but have taken great care to appear youthful. They're always eager to marshal new believers, and while their methods of recruitment vary wildly from one immortalist to the next, their message is always the same.
Imagine that death may be an option. Imagine that aging could be reversed.
An immortalist named Zoltan Istvan has spent years running for various public offices as a write-in candidate, with living forever as his platform. He and his robotic running mate campaign by driving a coffin-shaped immortality bus around the country. He never seems to make it very far in the elections, but according to him, he has an eternity to keep trying.
Because I actually don't think I will die.
Their logic is that the more unified people become in declaring a desire to live forever, the more pressure placed on the scientific fields to break through the biological barriers preventing it. They'll often speak of the life expectancy increase humanity has seen over the last several centuries, claiming that we must be on the cusp of reaching some sort of escape velocity if only we could focus our efforts.
And the concept of human immortality, no longer science fiction. It's getting written up in published scientific journals about the prospect of humans living for indefinite periods of time.
But in the 1960s, at the beginning of the modern immortalist movement, it was difficult to imagine that technology which would cure aging and death would arrive in one's lifetime. So the early immortalists placed all their faith in the notion of freezing and waiting. It started with the publication of a book titled The Prospect of Immortality by a physics professor named Robert Ettinger. The book opens with the following assertion: most of us now living have a chance for personal, physical immortality. It was the first proposal of what would become the field of cryonics, entering a capsule at the moment of death and lowering the temperature of one's body to the point where cellular decay stops. Embedded in this idea was the hypothesis that all disease, even death itself, would one day be cured. And when that time arrived, the scientist of the future would have pods of waiting bodies to reanimate. With bad luck, the frozen people will simply remain dead as they would in the grave, Ettinger wrote. But with good luck, the manifest destiny of science will be realized, and the resuscities will drink the wine of centuries unborn.
When it's time for me to go, I will be all taken care of. I'm looking forward to being brought back, and I don't know exactly what's going to be there, but whatever it is, I'll be glad of it. It's better than rotten.
It was an imaginative idea, or as many scientists at the time claimed, absurd. But the book attracted legions of followers. Advertisements for meetup groups to discuss Ettinger's ideas appeared in classified ads around the country. There were even reports of something called the Abolish Death Committee that began showing up to pressure funeral parlors to freeze the recently deceased instead of burying them. But the problem was that no one had ever frozen another human being with the intention of preserving them into the future. And although the idea seemed exciting, no one wanted to be the first to attempt it. But in 1967, an unlikely pioneer rose to the challenge. His name was Bob Nelson, and he wasn't a physicist or a mortician or a medical practitioner. He was a TV repairman, living with his wife and 3 children in California, and he'd been studying Ettinger's book since the day it was published. He joined the California branch of the Life Extension Society, which had only just formed following the book's publication, and he soon found himself in a leadership position.
I visualized scientists in white coats, and I wasn't sure I'd even be able to get in. But much to my surprise, it wasn't anything like that. It was just a group of ordinary people who had shared the same interest as I did. Found out that I was one of the more knowledgeable people about suspended animation that were in attendance. Surprised me, and it led to my being elected president of the Cryonics Society.
Their slogan, freeze, wait, reanimate, served as a catchy distillation of their mission statement. To inform everyone possible of the hypothesis that if a person is properly frozen at or near clinical death and stored in a cryogenic environment, that person may be repaired, reanimated, and even rejuvenated in the future and restored to normal life. Bob's inexperience only emboldened him, as he was undaunted by the complexities that would go into freezing and storing a body. He had read Ettinger's book well, so he knew to use a cardiac compression machine to keep the blood circulating while dry ice begins to lower the body temperature, and then transfer the body to liquid nitrogen to preserve at -320 degrees Fahrenheit. So they put out a call, wanted, 1 human body in return for a slight possibility of life after death. If interested, contact the Life Extension Society. And when a volunteer came forward, a 73-year-old man named James Bedford who was dying of cancer, Bob Nelson agreed to make him the world's first immortal.
We have a quote from a Dr. Stanley Jacob, co-discoverer of DMSO. He's quoted as saying, "He's dead once he's frozen, and he's not going to come back again."
I say that that statement is absolutely ridiculous. I don't think there's anybody that can make that statement without and be absolutely convinced of it. It's purely unscientific. Scientists would never make such a statement.
Not many members of the scientific or medical community wanted to associate with cryonics or immortality, aside from offering the occasional ridicule. Theologians were also outspoken, warning the immortalist against grasping at equality with God. But for Nelson and Ettinger, it was a war on death, as worthy as any fight they could imagine. So when James Bedford passed away on January 12, 1967, Dr. Robert Ettinger was there to assist Nelson in the procedure.
A model demonstrates how one person, a California man who died of cancer, has already been frozen. A freezing liquid replaces the blood supply, and the subject is wrapped in aluminum foil and placed in a capsule at 220 degrees below 0 centigrade.
It was impossible to know if the freezing of James Bedford was a success, since it would likely be centuries before anyone would test it. But with Bedford wrapped in foil, suspended in a tube, it certainly looked successful. And so, with the initial shock of the first freezing out of the way, others began to line up, and Nelson froze them all. Bob Nelson froze a total of 7 bodies over the next several years. Their ages ranged from 73 years old to 6 years old. Other cryonics facilities began popping up around the United States, and they too began freezing bodies, bringing the cryonics industry into full swing. The first generation of Immortalists saw cause to celebrate, as immortality no longer seemed purely theoretical. There was now something actionable they could do to give themselves a real chance. But science still had a long way to go before it caught up with the Immortalist ambitions. And as each one settled into their indefinite wait, they were completely at the mercy of their caretakers.
If I do business with a Bob Nelson, and someday I'm revived and I've paid Bob Nelson through my estate a handsome chunk of dough, and I come out of the ice cube tray or whatever it is, and I'm just not the way I was told I would be, and I go back to Nelson to get a refund, they tell me you can't talk to him, he's in the freezer.
The first generation of Immortalists knew they were gambling, and many acknowledged that the likelihood of their ever reanimating was infinitesimal. But in order to give them even the slightest chance, Nelson would have to bring them into the future intact. And this, above all, proved to be the most difficult task. Irreversible brain damage occurs within minutes of death. And because Nelson's patients often passed unexpectedly, getting to the bodies quickly was a challenge, and sometimes days would elapse before he could begin lowering their body temperature. But this was far from the only problem. The freezing process formed ice crystals in and around the cells, which could puncture the cell membranes. This was most problematic in the brain, as it was considered the only truly irreplaceable organ. To mitigate it, Nelson replaced the blood with a biological antifreeze called dimethyl sulfoxide and pumped it through with cardiac compression. But the consensus was that a significant degree of cellular damage was inevitable. But Nelson clung to a belief that carried him forward. No matter how rudimentary his methods were and whatever mistakes were made, the brilliant scientist of the future who would have cured death could fix it.
In other words, in effect, I would be dealing with a guy that I would maybe never see again, who himself was relying upon the goodwill and the provocation, the motivation, and all the other things of people, indeed perhaps centuries from now.
Money was another issue. Cryonic preservation was expensive, and Nelson's patients were asked to set aside enough funds to maintain anywhere from 50 to 500 years worth of liquid nitrogen. It was an impossible figure to calculate and even more impossible to provide. So Nelson just asked them to give him whatever they could, and more often than not, what they could give him was nothing.
I mean, if I'd have gotten a little bit from different people, but nothing, zero. From the very people that were part of the Cryonics group.
But Nelson couldn't say no, especially to the families of terminally ill children who believed he held the only hope for them to live again. Finding a place to store them for the long sleep presented yet another challenge. His long-term plan was to build a cryonics facility, but in the meantime he kept them inside mortuaries and friends' garages. Then ultimately an underground vault in the Chatsworth, California cemetery. But the real problem was the dewars, where the bodies themselves were preserved. They were cheaply made and completely unreliable. Nelson had to monitor them daily to make sure they were still working. He knew if they stopped, even for a day, it would all be over. There can never be a single mistake, not for hundreds of years, Nelson would later write. When one doer failed, he'd take the body out and cram it into one of the remaining ones. But one by one, they all failed. He had a total of 9 bodies to care for, after he'd accepted a couple from other cryonics facilities who were facing similar issues. And despite the odds, Nelson still somehow managed to preserve them for several years. But when the last doer failed, and with no money to replace or repair it, Nelson knew they would never wake up.
I went out to the desert, in Palm Desert, a little secret paradise of mine that had a river, little stream river running through it, beautiful vegetation on both sides of it, in the middle of the desert, and spent the day out there and had like a memorial service just between myself and them, and said goodbye to them.
That was hard.
No, that was horrible, horrible. But on the other hand, I felt that I had done everything possible. I tried my very best.
In March of 1979, Nelson locked up the Chatsworth Cemetery vault and walked away. When the authorities opened the vault a year later, they found the bodies had thawed. The newspaper headlines were unforgiving, and so were the California courts. When the horrified families of the deceased sued Nelson for millions of dollars, they won, easily. It was the first real attempt at immortality, and many sought to interpret it as a new and ridiculous scam, capitalizing on the desperate. But the modern immortalists hold a certain reverence for these early efforts. Every year they celebrate two holidays. January 12th, James Bedford Day, the anniversary of the first person to be frozen.
And this evening we celebrate Bedford Day. We celebrate Dr. James Bedford as the first patient to be placed in cryostasis on January 12th, 1967.
And a day they call Remembrance of the Resurrectables, where they pay respects to the people who are frozen and waiting to live again.
We shall hold the light for these men and women and children until we shall all meet again in a brighter future. We shall now remember the Resurrectables.
The field of cryonics would continue, but the first generation of immortals lost any opportunity they may have had to resurrect. Bob Nelson turned over the 9 bodies he'd abandoned to their respective family members, who relocated them to cemetery plots. With the exception of James Bedford, who'd been transferred to another cryonics facility in Arizona, no one who was frozen before 1974 currently remains in suspension. By the 1980s, the public at large seemed disturbed by cryonics. The thawing, the mishandling of the deceased by technicians with no expertise, it all seemed like desecration. But the desire to live forever is ancient, and it would take many forms.
You seriously believe you're immortal? Oh yes, we feel that potential is in every human being.
Charles Paul Brown.
I am Charles, who is physically immortal now.
Bernadine.
I am physically immortal. I'd rather say I'm Bernadine. I'm here to stay.
And James Stroll.
We're immortal. We're not stupid. We realize how strong the intelligence and the programming of death is on this planet. And so we're out to find other people who will join in with us and turn that tide of death.
Together they formed a trio of immortalists called the Eternal Flame. It was the late 1980s when they began making headlines in Scottsdale, Arizona, a city with one of the highest proportions of elderly citizens in the United States. They arrived with a carefully curated image, often seen wearing matching outfits and presenting as a self-described trinity. Their brand of immortality didn't involve cryonics, nor did it rely on the age reversal methods that later movements would emphasize. They proposed that immortality already existed within the cells of the body, and unlocking it was simply a test of will.
You begin to touch, you begin to heal, you begin to wake bodies up, begin to tell them they don't have to die, tell them it's a goddamn lie.
Charles and Bernadine were married, but all three seemed to share an intimate relationship, living together in the same house, even allegedly sharing the same bed. Charles was the Trinity's messiah. He claimed to have experienced his cellular awakening at the age of 25, and not only became physically immortal himself, but could grant it to those close to him via a process he called cellular intercourse.
The cells of the body begin to transmit to the brain, they begin to open the brain cells. But if the body isn't awake, it doesn't do any good for the brain to be open. And that's the portion we feel that is locked in for human beings to begin to awaken on a cellular level to physical immortality.
We feel that the immortal cells of the body have experienced a deep sleep, a sleep of death, Charles explained. As a person hears of immortality, there is a responding vibration in the cells. There is somewhere a deep remembrance that says, yes, I was born to be immortal. I was not born to die. That is the cellular awakening. He was the world's first immortal. James and Bernadine were numbers 2 and 3. and they preached a type of herd immunity from death, which could be achieved for those who would congregate around them, declare in unison their desire to live forever, and allow the influence of the eternal flame to penetrate their bodies down to the genetic code.
You're saying if you use yours and I use mine and we use ours together, a cancer cell can't grow in us?
Absolutely. There's an energy. There's an energy that begins to throw it off. The immune system begins to be strengthened, and we're tapping into the global, the collective mind, and it's so exciting.
I want to break the appointment with death in your body became a type of catchphrase for the trio. Or as Bernadine liked to say, it's not intelligent to die, it's embarrassing to die.
One of the ways it works is putting ourselves with people who feel the same way, that they're going to stay on this planet forever, that we're here to outlive death. And I feel that I wasn't born to die, I was born to live. That's what seems natural, that's what's comfortable. I think dying is uncomfortable, it's unnatural.
Services at the Church of the Eternal Flame were theatrical events, and it quickly became the hotspot of Scottsdale, Arizona. As a former nightclub singer, Charles would take the stage and serenade his congregation with songs of cellular rejuvenation.
All the cells of our bodies are speaking for a new life.
Bernadine and James would round out the sermons, striding the stage with an evangelist urgency, careful not to let the energy drop below absolute fervor. The Immortalist movement up until then had developed a bleak tone full of catastrophe. But there were no melting corpses at the Church of the Eternal Flame, only eternal, vibrant, fashionable life.
Really, it's embarrassing to die, isn't it?
By the early 1990s, the trio were touring the country and reaching around 20,000 people via their Immortality mailing list. Their congregation, consisting mostly of the elderly, were growing more loyal by the day. Many were uprooting their lives and leaving behind their families to move to Arizona in order to be closer to the trio. As the Eternal Flame preached, you had to remain with your fellow immortals, or the cellular intercourse would stop. "They call us death," said the daughter of one of the Eternal Flame's members. "They say we're living in darkness."
You will not be able to turn off the feelings of this new life within your body. You will not be able to go home and return to a pattern of death and dying.
The Eternal Flame had cultivated what their fellow Immortalist in the Cryonics realm lacked: a guarantee, backed with religious conviction.
Of course, you had individuals like Ettinger who wrote The Prospect of Immortality. But he was coming from the place of cryonics, the freezing of the body, and then reanimating in the future, some future generation.
Cloning.
Cloning, all of this. Individuals are paying thousands of dollars to make sure that their body is frozen in the hope that someday science will perfect a cure for the disease that took them, and then they can be reanimated. All of that was wonderful, but again, as I said, it was a hope.
The reputation of Cryonics, meanwhile, was attempting to recover from what was being referred to as the Great Chatsworth Cryonic Thaw. Bob Nelson made a surreptitious exit from the Immortality movement, and would only surface again decades later with his confessional memoir, "Freezing People is Not Easy." A new cohort of cryonicists arose, shook off the previous failures as nothing more than growing pains of a new technology, and started again.
If I asked everyone out there, "Are you afraid of going blind?" Most people would say, "Well, yes, that would be a terrifying prospect." And if I said, "Are you afraid of going deaf?" they'd say, "Absolutely." And if I said, "Are you afraid of losing your mind?" they'd say, "Absolutely." And if I said, "Are you afraid of being paralyzed?" they'd say, "Absolutely." Death is all of those things. It's very undesirable.
The company Alcor, who were now in possession of the body of James Bedford, the first person to be frozen, became the flagship enterprise. They were also based in Scottsdale, Arizona, alongside the Eternal Flame Foundation. And like the Eternal Flame, Alcor recommended their members relocate to Scottsdale for the sake of their own immortality. It would be in the best interest to be near the facility when they passed away, or to use Alcor's language, when they reached the end of their first life cycle. They intended to avoid many of Nelson's early mistakes by streamlining the whole freezing process, starting this time while the patient was still alive.
This notice contains instructions to the emergency medical people
telling them what to do if I am found dead or near death. The 2 bottles below are to replace the blood. This is the belt of the apnea monitor, which I put around me when I go to sleep, so that it will signal if I have a cardiac arrest. This is very important because the freezing process must begin as soon as possible in order to minimize brain damage.
Some members tattooed instructions on what to do and who to call to whomever might find them deanimated. But most members were recommended to just wear bracelets. In their view, there was a direct correlation with how quickly they were frozen after death and their likelihood of ever being resurrected. Many aspects of the vitrification process were improved, but ice crystal formation remained an issue. But if there was one thing the new cryonicists took from the old, it was the faith that future science would have a remedy for every shortcoming.
It's certainly true that the people frozen here have had additional damage from the freezing damage. But it's also very likely that the future repair capabilities will be an immeasurable amount better than what we have today.
Despite cryonics still being as unpopular as ever, there were over 100 people to sign up throughout the 80s and the 90s. And the cryonicists would need to find a permanent storage for all of them, along with an indefinite supply of coolant to keep them preserved. The entire process would be lengthy and expensive.
The whole process beginning to end about 2 days on average.
And it costs?
Whole body suspension costs $120,000 at Alcor. About a third of that gets used in the initial processes you just saw, the surgery and the cool down phase, and then the balance goes into a patient care trust fund, which generates the income necessary to keep people in suspension.
Money seemed trivial in the pursuit of eternal life, but the cost would still have to come down to make it accessible. And in doing so, Alcor made the public an offer so uncanny, it called for a complete reimagining of the Immortalist vision of the future.
For those of us as cryonicists, we've made our decision. We believe that life is the most important thing in the world, our lives and the lives of the people that we love and care about, and no price is too high to pay, and no odds are too small to take.
By the 1990s, cryonics had properly arrived. Most science fiction movies featured it as a plot device. There were rumors that Walt Disney had frozen himself upon death, and many were approaching the idea with cautious optimism. But there was a sticking point that kept the industry from being truly taken seriously. The science was, and would remain for some time, completely untested.
What about the good doctor and I decided we're healthy right now, knock wood. We want to see if your system works, so you can come in and kill us and do all of these things. Can you then bring us back?
No, that is illegal because you have
What
to...
if we made it legal? Could you bring it back?
That would be interesting to try, but you see, we are...
The cryonicist of the future might be capable of miracles, but the cryonicist of the present couldn't do anything other than freeze the body. Even then, they couldn't be sure they were doing so without causing irreversible damage. Their rationalization was that, given enough time and imagination, nothing was irreversible. And cryonics should be viewed as nothing more than a slight chance where none before existed.
The process is unperfected. For people frozen today, it's going to be a long time, if ever, that they are brought back to life. However, most people who have made preparations, such as myself, are healthy and vigorous, and we may be frozen by perfected methods.
But even if the science was sound, it wasn't easy to trust the people behind it. Alcor was asking its members to open a life insurance policy naming the company as its beneficiary in order to pay for the procedure. And when they began to offer their discount package, a neurosuspension where only the head is frozen and the rest is cremated, many began to wonder if they were asking too much on faith.
It is called cryonics. It involves freezing a head or a body at 320 degrees below zero in hopes that science will someday figure out a way to bring back the dead.
How much does it cost you for your head to be frozen?
$35,000.
$35,000 for the head? $150,000 for the body?
Prioritizing the brain above all else was a bedrock principle of cryonics, but Alcor asked its clients to imagine a future where the head wasn't just a priority, it was the only thing necessary to keep. I don't really understand why people want to take their broken down old body with them, said Alcor representative Max Moore. In the future, it'll probably be easier to start from scratch and just regenerate the body anyway. A neurosuspension required less storage and less nitrogen, but the convenience would significantly add to the burden of future cryonicists, who were already asked to thaw, repair, and resurrect the immortals, and must now find them a new body as well. But the scientific questions would take a backseat to the legal ones when a story broke of a woman named Dora Kent, who'd been given a neurosuspension at Alcor in 1987.
A bizarre story out of Riverside tonight. Officials for the coroner's office there are investigating the possibility that an elderly woman whose head was surgically removed by a body freezing firm may have been alive during the operation.
Dora Kent was 83 years old and in poor health. She knew she'd be reaching the end of her first life cycle soon. For the Kents, immortality was to be a family tradition. Dora's son, Saul, had been involved with the movement since the very beginning, and his entry point was none other than the textbook itself.
Prospect of Immortality by Robert Ettinger. They talked about what was then just called freezing people. The word cryonics hadn't been invented yet. I ran off to the beach, which is where I used to spend a lot of my time in those days, and I read the book, and that got me involved in actually doing something about aging and death.
Saul Kent became an avid immortalist, establishing his own Cryonics Research Institute and participating in many of the early freezings. He'd written some books full of daydreams about the future and would eventually find his niche in what he called the life extension revolution. Saul's company, the Life Extension Foundation, sold dietary supplements. He often disputed with the Food and Drug Administration over the government approval of various ingredients, and his business would see multiple FDA raids over the course of its lifetime. Saul and his business partner Bill Falloon considered the FDA to be a terrorist organization who kept their citizens from naturally extending their lifespans. They opened an Fda Holocaust Museum to document all the crimes against humanity that lay at the FDA's feet.
We call it a Holocaust Museum because we have substantiated that the FDA has caused the suffering and death of millions of American citizens every single year.
But as Saul's mother began inching closer to deanimation, no amount of life extension supplements would help. So Saul turned to Alcor.
This guy is a nut. I want to know something.
He's not, don't demean the guest. Just ask the question.
Why didn't he bury the body with the head? I mean, why didn't he freeze everything? Why just the head?
Well, because she was extremely elderly. She had atherosclerosis, she had osteoporosis, and I thought she needed a new body, which the future will bring.
Dora knew she was headed to Alcor for the long sleep, but she was unaware that her son had arranged for everything below her neck to be discarded.
My mother was aware that that was an option. I don't think she knew that we were only going to preserve the brain. I think if and when she comes back and she has a brand new body and she remembers the past, I think she'll be perfectly happy with the fact that we preserve the brain, because if she's going to come back, she's going to have a body. And the body, in all likelihood, will be a much better one than she left this life with, so...
When the time came, Saul would do the same. He anticipated a reunion where he and Dora would be given new bodies, maybe even multiple bodies to swap in and out of, and reunite not only as mother and son, but time travelers. It would be the kind of reunion that's never happened before, Saul said. We may become more like friends and less like mother and son. Not only would we have the entire past to discuss, but potentially an illimitable future. Dora was staying in an elderly care facility in Riverside, California. But as the hour drew close, Saul was adamant that she pass away at Alcor, with a team of technicians ready to begin the procedure immediately.
I received a call at 2 a.m. in the morning from her son, and he very much wanted his mother here in the facility so that there would not be ischemic time. That's time with lack of blood flow at normal body temperature, and so that the procedure could be carried out under the best circumstances possible.
After Dora passed, her head was removed and frozen with so little time elapsed that she would likely have the least amount of brain damage of anyone in cryosuspension, making her a strong candidate for the first to resurrect. But Alcor had overlooked one detail. There had been no doctor present to declare Dora legally dead. Alcor's surgeons were a team of enthusiasts wholly dedicated to the defeat of death, but there was not a medical doctor among them. The death certificate wasn't issued until days later, with Dora's head already at negative 320 degrees Fahrenheit. In the county coroner's opinion, there was no proof that Dora had passed away naturally before the procedure began. The cryopreservants pumped into her bloodstream by the cardiac thumper were so well circulated, it even appeared she might have been alive.
We're not stupid. We're not that stupid. I admit we've made some errors in judgment that I wish we hadn't made, but we are not foolish enough to start this procedure before someone is in full cardiac and respiratory arrest, and that criteria, and it is not appropriate to continue further life support with them. And that certainly was the case in Mrs. Kent's case.
Alcor suggested that the suspicion was due to a general prejudice against cryonics as an idea, and a desire to inject oversight into their unregulated industry. The cryonics institutes across the country had been enjoying a federal gray zone, outside the laws that govern mortuaries and medical facilities, using the Anatomical Gift Act as a way to claim ownership over their clients' bodies. Alcor considered any challenge to their autonomy to be a threat to their eternal lives. But the coroner insisted on an autopsy, a complete autopsy, to determine Dora's cause of death to a certainty, and it would come at the cost of her immortality. He would need to thaw her head.
What we're trying to establish here is whether the death of Dora Kent came under mysterious circumstances, and at this point we cannot tell without the complete body.
The police arrived at Alcor with a warrant to autopsy Dora Kent's brain, but Saul made sure they never found it.
The whereabouts of Dora Kent's head are unknown, but it is believed that her son has hidden it somewhere.
Dora Kent was safe. Saul had taken his mother's head and was keeping it at, quote, a private residence, but would say nothing more.
You know where your mother's head is, right?
I have no comment at this time.
But it would only buy them some time. Early the following year, the county coroner, Alcor, and Saul Kent all stood in front of a judge, who had the burden of answering a crucial question for immortality. Did the law demand that the immortals be thawed if an investigation called for it? The answer, either way, would set a legal precedent.
The court finds that the coroner threatens to thaw the remains of the decedents in cryonic suspension at the Alcor Foundation, which act would be in violation of the rights of the decedents.
A Riverside judge today handed a victory to Alcor, the Riverside lab that freezes human remains in hopes of bringing them back to life at some later time. Channel 9's Les Kumagai says Alcor will not have to turn over a controversial human head to the coroner.
In the end, the efforts of the coroner only managed to help cryonics. It was not just a victory, but validation for the very pursuit of immortality itself. Alcor now refers to the whole saga as their finest hours. The location of Dora's head, however, would stay a secret.
Where was the head during all of this time?
I really don't want to comment on that. It was at a private person's residence. It was not at mine. A private person was maintaining it in their residence. That's where it was.
What do you mean a private person is maintaining?
A residence. Someone took it home.
But none of this freezing and decapitation would ever be necessary for the eternal flame, who were meanwhile growing by the thousands.
There's a time for everything. This is the time to stay alive forever. So we're taking advantage of that.
Right.
We're not letting it slip by. We're not waiting for science to come up and say it's okay.
The Eternal Flame's message of immortality here and now, marketed through their unique brand of peer pressure, seemed to work, and they soon found themselves holding sold-out cellular intercourse retreats across the country. They just released a book titled Together Forever, which they describe as having written largely in unison as a single author. They were attracting plenty of attention, mostly from daytime talk show hosts.
What I don't understand is if you say you're immortal, I mean, you're only what? How old are you? 53. 53. You're only 53 years in, and if you don't mind me saying so, you're aging. So what's it going to be like when you're 560? What's it going to look like?
I don't know. I have no idea.
But outside of their church, the only ones taking them seriously were cult awareness organizations. And in the early 90s, they became the target of a collection of anti-ageism activists called the Grey Panthers. A Grey Panther named Winnie Lockwood spent several months posing as an aspiring immortal in order to infiltrate the Eternal Flame.
They are convinced that Charles is their link to immortality.
I have seen a woman get down on her knees and hug Charles around the legs and saying, whatever thou biddest, I will do.
From the inside, Winnie watched members empty their bank accounts as offerings to the church. She suspected that one member was starving in order to give the trio every dollar she owned. She saw another sign over the deed to her home. Exposing the financial abuse wouldn't be enough to deter the people who thought they were buying eternal life. But with a congregation who were already near death and their loyalty built on the promise that they would never reach it, one thing could threaten it all.
Doesn't it destroy your credibility, though, when this happens? Death certificate of a follower. What happened to her?
Doesn't it all? Alma Northquist was a beautiful individual.
Followers of the Eternal Flame were supposed to be, as the book described them, a new species, so immortal that even unexpected tragedy would elude them. Quote, there is an alertness, there is an awareness that intuitively keeps us from putting ourselves in a life-threatening situation. We are not leaving any room for death to happen by accident, by what is called a natural death, or by any other way of dying. We're closing all of the doors of death.
She believed in you, she followed you, she wanted life forever?
Yes, she did.
What happened? She's dead.
What happened? She's dead. She died. A faithful follower died. There may be others that will die. Because to be a follower is not enough. There has to be an absolute biological change, a biological experiencing.
As the elderly followers began to pass away, the Eternal Flame's membership plummeted. The trio had been exposed, and all it had taken was time. In order to find their footing in the 21st century, they left behind the name Eternal Flame and rebranded as People Unlimited. But their message was unchanged. Death was still just an idea that could be rejected. Immortality was a state of mind.
We actually believe it's possible for the human body, the physical body, to live free of death. And I'm experiencing that. It's more and more all the time. The longer I'm here, the better I feel. Instead of the older I'm getting or something.
The only difference was their reach, which was a far cry from their packed congregations of the 80s and 90s. But it wouldn't stay that way for long. By the turn of the millennium, many felt they were nearing the time that Ettinger had predicted in the 1960s, the unlimited lifespan. There were different predictions for how it might come about. Nanotechnology that could repair aging cells, digitizing and uploading human consciousness. It all seemed somewhere on the horizon, and for the first time, it seemed possible to live long enough to see it. Immortalists stocked their shelves with life extension supplements and adopted strict diets and exercise regimens. Longevity by any means became the focus. A popular futurist and self-described transhuman previously named Faridun Esfandiari predicted the year of his 100th birthday, 2030, to be the year of immortality.
I'd say if you're around in the year 2010, there's a very, very good chance that you'll be around in the year 2030. If you're around in 2030, there's an excellent chance you can coast to immortality.
He changed his name to Futureman 2030, abbreviated to FM 2030 to commemorate it. But he passed away 31 years too early and entered cryonic suspension at Alcor soon after. Cryonics began to be seen as more of a backup plan, something that the old and sick would need, but the young and healthy could potentially avoid.
Honestly, I have to say I hope that I never have to use their services. The goal is to not have Alcor treat me as a patient, but it's really nice to know I got that in the background. It's a backstop. It's like a safety belt, if you will. The goal is to just stay alive.
The messaging of cryonics was, as always, optimistic. Alcor's president took to signing his letters sooner and later, and filled his members' mailboxes with monthly newsletters to update them on the advancements in the field. It's like the lottery, Alcor's president said. The prize is fantastic, the odds are long, but you have to buy a ticket to win. Scientific and financial criticism remained, but the industry saw steady growth. By the mid-2000s, there were 3 cryonics institutes operating in the United States: Alcor in Arizona, the Cryonics Institute in Michigan, and Suspended Animation in Florida, who became known for their ambulance service that would swoop in after a patient's death to begin the freezing process.
We're the ambulance service for patients who wish to be full-body cryo donors, patients who are looking for cryostabilization for their final remains.
In 2005, a fourth arose in Moscow called Cryonics, which became the first operational cryonics institute outside of the United States, and they took Alcor's lead in recommending their patients freeze only their heads. People froze their pets. Divorces were caused by one spouse wanting to be frozen while the other didn't. The children of baseball legend Ted Williams had their father decapitated and frozen despite his will specifying the opposite. It was a turbulent time to be an aspiring immortal, and as technology began to seem increasingly futuristic, the excitement and impatience grew alongside it. The 2010s would see many of the original Immortalists pass away. Dr. Robert Ettinger, author of The Prospect of Immortality and arguably the harbinger of the entire community, deanimated in 2011 at the age of 92. His son David helped him become the 106th person to enter suspension at the Cryonics Institute in Michigan. He currently awaits resurrection alongside his mother, his wife, and his ex-wife. Bob Nelson, the first cryonicist, deanimated years later in 2018. He also entered suspension in Michigan alongside his mentor as the Institute's 171st patient. The industry that the two of them pioneered in the 60s has spread across the world. A new cryonics institute sprouted in China in 2015 with another on its way in Australia. Cryonics in Russia appeared in the news in 2021 when the husband and wife founders divorced and the ex-wife attempted to drain the liquid nitrogen from the doers and steal the frozen bodies. Alcor remains the most recognizable of the companies. They perform as many as 13 suspensions per year, and they now claim to assume the responsibility of not only reanimating their patients at a future date, but reintegrating them into society. The plan is not for them to revive us, their website states. The plan is that we, the Alcor community, will revive ourselves. Photos and memory books are stored in a vault to help revived patients reorient themselves in the future. And their trust fund that's meant to keep their patients in suspension throughout the centuries has ballooned to nearly $19 million. The marketing of cryonics has been made illegal in some places like British Columbia, but the idea has no trouble reaching an audience. Worldwide, there are currently 502 people in cryonic suspension, with thousands more signed up.
On the one hand, if I get cremated, I know I'm not coming back for sure. With Alcor, I have a shot at being here in the future, and I'd love to be here 50 years, 100 years from now, and be part of life.
Saul Kent never disclosed the location of his mother's head. He and Bill Falloon remained prominent immortalists into the 21st century, attempting to build a long-term immortality fortress they called Timeship. Timeship was meant to house up to 10,000 frozen heads and bodies inside conditions that could withstand most conceivable disasters. But the project never made it past the concept art phase of development. And in 2013, Falloon shifted his focus to founding a church in eastern Florida called the Church of Perpetual Life.
Our church is all for any technology that will enable human beings to escape the confines of nature.
Based loosely on the ideas of 19th century philosopher Nikolai Fedorov, the Church of Perpetual Life believes that a species-wide coordination of the defeat of death is our ultimate human purpose. Quote, "We believe in our Creator's divine plan for all humanity to have infinite lifespans in perfect health and eternal joy, rendering death to be optional." Monthly meetings at the church revolve around celebrations of youth, discussing developments in longevity research, and sharpening any other tool in the Immortalist toolbox. Open mic nights occur regularly.
Hi, everybody. I just wanted to touch on a couple things. Rapamycin is kind of an interesting life extension. Pardon? Interesting life extension medicine.
Representatives of cryonics appear frequently, from Alcor, the Cryonics Institute, and Suspended Animation, to deliver a pitch to the most perfectly curated target audience imaginable. Zoltan Istvan is occasionally seen parking the Immortality bus at the church in order to give a sermon.
We can conquer death through science. This is a feasible goal. In the next 10, 20, 30 years, especially if we put enough resources into it, we can conquer death.
In 2014, Charles Paul Brown, founder of the Eternal Flame, passed away due to complications with Parkinson's at the age of 79. The trio had been largely out of the limelight for decades following the end of the Eternal Flame. But after Charles passed, James and Bernadine resurged.
Immortality is here now. We're not talking longevity. Longevity's out the door for me. Immortality is what I'm after. Immortality is what I'm after. I'm out to reach everybody that feels that way now.
Their speeches these days are just as spirited, but there's an over-reliance on fan service and callbacks.
I want to make it embarrassing to die. Embarrassing to die.
They've managed to stick around in part due to their regular appearances at the Church of Perpetual Life and their People Unlimited memberships, where they offer discounted supplements and early access to age reversal information for a substantial monthly fee. Many who are interested in cryonics and immortality dislike James and Bernadine's prominence in the community, but they've made themselves unavoidable with their yearly festival called Revolution Against Aging and Death. James and Bernadine founded Radfest in 2016, and it's arguably become the main platform for all walks of Immortalists to make their case. And similar to a Church of Perpetual Life service or a People Unlimited gathering, there's a heavy emphasis on performance. Due to Radfest, James and Bernadine attract a lot of high-profile attention from outlets such as Vice and The Guardian, none of whom make mention of their past as the Eternal Flame.
This might be an inappropriate question. Are you two together, or are you business partners?
No, nothing's inappropriate. No,
Right.
no, we're business partners. I think she's very sexy, though.
Can't disagree with that.
I hope so.
Unsurprisingly, most Radfest attendees are older, and based on the price of admission, likely wealthy. And some good has undeniably resulted.
The Interdisciplinary Stem Cell Institute in Miami gets a $25 million donation. This is fantastic news. This is right after Radfest, someone wrote a check to enhance stem cell research.
But there's much of the Immortalist community that this demographic doesn't capture, and in their world, it can be hard to know what's real and what isn't. For example, Alcor has recently claimed that what they're aiming to do isn't really meant to bring back the dead, but to pause the process of dying.
They think maybe what we're doing is trying to bring back the dead, and we're not. We're trying to stop the dying process until a technology can be developed to restore them to health and function. It's more along the lines of placing a person in a medical coma.
But according to Alcor's website, over half of their recent patients have been decapitated, and it's a stretch to categorize these frozen heads as only being in a coma. There's always been a fair amount of disagreement from the scientific majority. In the past, the Society for Cryobiology has even threatened to excommunicate its members if they were found participating in cryonics. But for many, this only makes them feel as if they're part of some underground coalition that will one day be vindicated, with their originators in the company of Darwin and Copernicus. Many of the individuals who have been a part of the Immortalist community for decades plan to remain a part of it for millennia to come. Bernadine is currently 81 years old, and she spent the last 40 years trying to convince herself and everyone around her that what happens to everything will not happen to her.
Brainwashing, yes, I think we do. We not only wash the brain, but we wash the whole body if a person desires that.
Bill Falloon has been known to board airplanes while wearing a protective helmet so that if the plane crashed, his head could be recovered and frozen. He said he couldn't understand why everyone else didn't do the same. It seems impossible that these people will escape the laws of biology, or that these frozen heads will ever wake up. And maybe all they're doing is discouraging their followers from accepting the inevitable. But as they argue, we can't know what the future will bring, and it's within that liminal space that their message finds its believers. Now watch this music video that was shown at the very first Radfest.
Aging is a symptom of us being alive. Doesn't mean we can't alter the way that we thrive. But if there's no cure and you're about to die, cryostasis is a chance to give you more time. Even if you're doubting it, still give it a try. I guarantee there's no chance being buried or fried. In the future, nanobots will get deep inside, repairing everything until you're back alive. Radical life extension. Radical life extension. extension. Eternal health is our intention. With radical life extension. Living on and on and on and on and on. Living on and on and on and on and on. Living on and on and on and on.
Talked with Robert Nelson. This whole idea is sort of an extension of the fountain of youth concept with which man has wrestled for centuries. We're all interested in some way of either hanging around or coming back as soon as possible, although why we want to fool around more than once with this veil of tears, I haven't the foggiest idea. How far along are we on the cryonics theory?
Unfortunately, no, not very far, Joe. My first introduction to the subject was the book, The Prospect of Immortality, written by Professor Robert Ettinger, who had some very good reasons to think that this was at least possible. And this is the reason that the cryonic societies have been established to further research in this area, to find out if indeed it is possible and how soon it may be achievable.